previous video walked us through an example showing how objects get created and used in code. I'd like to go through that same example in Eclipse so you can see what it'll look like when you're actually writing and developing the code. I'd like to go through that same example in Eclipse so you can see what it'll look like when you're actually writing and developing the code. So I have the same two files in Eclipse that we talked about in the last video. Here is the account class. It is an instantiable class. Every object will have an instance variable named balance, and the two things you can do are ask the object for its balance or tell it you want to make a deposit and increase your balance. In addition, here is the runner class, which we watched execute on paper, well, video, in the last video. What I'd like to do is use the debugger to step through this to show exactly what happens in Eclipse, and it's going to look a lot like what happened in the last video. It's just a different way of seeing the same thing. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you is my screen's pretty big, and we're going to want to see what's happening in both of these classes. So I'm going to pull this one over here, and now I can see both the instantiable class and the runnable class. I'm going to put a breakpoint on the first executable line of code. These declarations are lines of code, but they don't actually do anything. They just tell the compiler something. This is the first statement that's going to actually do something. And then I'm going to run that in the debugger. Now it comes up and it asks if I want to go to a different perspective. In Eclipse, perspectives are sets of windows that are arranged for a particular purpose, and I definitely want to go to the debug perspective. And in fact, every time the debugger stops at a breakpoint, I want to go to the debug perspective. So I'm going to tell it to remember my decision. Switch. Okay, so now we can see I have my two files. I can look over here and see that this is what's running. It is my runner class that is running, and it's at a breakpoint at line 9, and that's highlighted over here. If I say step over, you see I now have a savings object whose type is account, and its ID is 33. Every object in the system gets a unique ID, so its ID is 33. And if we look at that object, its balance is 0. So when it created that object, it allocated the space for it, it put the 0 in the balance, and the reference to that new object was stored in my savings variable. Now I'm about to do savings.deposit, passing in a 3213. So I'm going to say step into, and that will make it stop at the very beginning of the method that you're calling. So I step into that, and you can see now it tells me I'm executing over here. Deposit amount is the 3213 that we passed in, and the object that it's executing on is always in a variable called this, and it's an object, and you see it has ID 33. That's the one that my savings variable was pointing at, and it has a balance of 0. If I step over this statement, it's going to add the 3213 to the 0 and store it back at balance. Ta-da! And when I return from here, we'll see that the saving object, ID 13, now has a balance of 3213. Perfect. So now this statement is going to create another account object whose and store it in my IRA variable. If I step over that, you can see here is a new account object, and you can tell that it's a different object because its ID is different from the other one's ID. And it has its own balance variable. So you can see the balance in my savings account is 3213, but the balance in my IRA is 0. So now we're going to call deposit, passing in 23, 24, 23 on the IRA object. So when I step into it, I'm expecting it to do it to this object, the one with ID 34. So when I step into, now I'm over here in the deposit method. There's the amount that I passed in, and it's doing it on object 34, which was the IRA object. So if I watch, its balance is 0. If I add deposit amount to it, it becomes 23, 24, 23. And when I return from there, now you can see that the IRA has a balance of 23, 24, 23, and savings still has its 32, 13. And I can actually deposit as many times as I want. So let's watch this one. Now we're going to do with the same IRA object. We're going to call the deposit method passing in 333.22. If I step into, we're in the deposit method. We've passed in 333.22, and we're doing it on the IRA object that has 23, 24, 23 as its balance. When it adds deposit amount to balance and stores it back into balance, you'll see balance becomes 26, 57, 45. And when I return from this, the IRA object now has that new balance. So every time we do something to an object, it has the potential to change the instance variables of that object. It does not affect the instance variables of other objects. So now I'm going to print out savings account balance colon space space, and then it's going to, this plus is going to be concatenate because this is not a number. It's going to call the get balance method on the savings object. So that's object with ID 33. If I step into that, now sometimes this happens. When you say step into and it goes someplace crazy, or it says it can't find the source code, don't panic. The system.out.println call is the thing that it stepped into. So you've stepped into the code of Java. Don't panic. Whenever that happens, just hit step return until you get back to your code, and then say step into again. Oh, and it did it again. Okay, step return, step into. Aha! So now we're over here at get balance, and the object that we're doing to this is ID 33. So it's doing it to the savings object, and you can see the balance is 3213. So this return statement is going to stop the execution of this method and make the call on it over here evaluate to 3213. So when we return from this and finish executing that print line, here is our output, savings balance colon 3213. Similarly, if we do look at this print line statement, it's doing the same thing, but it's going to call it on IRA.getBalance. So when I say step into here, again, just return until you get to your code and step into again. All right, now I'm at getBalance. It's called it on the IRA object that has 26, 57, 45 as its balance. So when I return to here, step over, there is IRA balance 26, 57, 45. So what I'm hoping that you can see in that is that when we create the object, even though there's only one time that we said a declaration of balance, because that is an instance variable declared outside of any of the methods, every object of that type that we create gets its own copy of that value. Thanks.